Ever get the feeling that some stories, well, they're kind of like shadows, They stick around, lurking just out of sight, but always kind of there in the back of your mind.
Oh, absolutely. Those stories that just get under your skin.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, a story that's haunted history for centuries. The Werewolf of Bedburg.
And what makes this story so fascinating, at least to me, is that it's not just about a monster, is it? It's about a society wrestling with these really deep anxieties and how those anxieties can twist our perceptions of reality.
Okay, so before we get ahead of ourselves, let's set the stage. We're in 16th century Germany.
Yeah.
What's the vibe like? Paint us a picture.
Well, imagine a world that's kind of constantly on edge. You've got the Protestant Reformation shaking the foundations of the church, right? You've got political intrigue and rumors of war swirling around. And on top of all that, there's this very real and terrifying threat of disease, particularly the plague. So you can imagine how these anxieties might, how do I put it?
Bubble to the surface.
Exactly. They bubble to the surface and manifest in some pretty unexpected ways. And it's in this pressure cooker of fear and uncertainty that the story of the Werewolf of Bedburg takes root.
So into this already volatile mix, we drop the story of Peter Stumpp. On the surface, just a regular farmer, but he becomes the prime suspect in a string of brutal killings.
And these aren't just your run-of-the-mill crimes either. We're talking about mutilated livestock, villagers attacked, like really gruesome stuff. Even centuries later, the details of these crimes are still chilling.
It's the stuff of nightmares.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, in a time when superstition was so ingrained in everyday life, it's not surprising that people start whispering about a werewolf.
Which is so interesting when you think about it, because if you look at the historical records, you see these werewolf trials happening alongside witch trials. It's almost like society needed a way to explain away the darkness, to find a scapegoat for the things it couldn't comprehend.
Right, like these trials were a way of trying to exert control over a world that felt increasingly chaotic and frightening.
Exactly. And so they land on Peter Stumpp.
So what makes him the target? What makes him stand out from the crowd?
Well, you've got all these rumors about Stumpp swirling around, people gossiping about his character, strange events they associate with him. But what really seals the deal, what makes him the prime suspect, is his confession. And it's not just a simple confession of guilt, it's a full-blown, detailed account. He says he made a pact with the devil when he was young, that he received a magical belt that allows him to transform into a wolf.
Wow, a magical belt, huh? That's quite the confession. But we have to talk about the elephant in the room here. Torture. How much can we really trust a confession extracted under duress? I mean, that's a huge factor to consider.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because torture was a tragically common practice in this era. But, and here's the thing that gets me, even considering that, the sheer detail in Stumpp's confession, it's striking. He describes his transformations, the killings, even claims he consumed the flesh of his victims, including, and this is where it gets really disturbing, his own son.
That's bone-chilling stuff. So what are we to make of this? Was Peter Stumpp really a werewolf, a man driven to madness, or just a desperate soul caught in the gears of circumstance, forced to confess to something he didn't do?
That's what we're here to unpack, right? Because the answer might be far more complex than any of us can imagine.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing, and the ones we do have might be from a completely different picture.
A very fitting analogy, because to understand the complexity of Stumpp's case, we really need to delve deeper into the historical context, really get a feel for what it meant to be accused of being a werewolf in the 16th century, how these trials worked, and what they reveal about the anxieties and beliefs of the time.
It's like trying to step back in time and see the world through 16th century eyes, But before we get too deep into the historical weeds, let's talk about the werewolf in the room, because for people back then, this wasn't just a campfire story, right?
Oh, absolutely not. This wasn't just some spooky tale. The werewolf was a very real embodiment of evil, and it was often directly connected to witchcraft, to the devil himself.
So we're talking about a whole belief system built around this creature, not just a guy who happens to turn into a wolf when the moon is full.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, because when you're accused of being a werewolf, you're not just accused of a crime, are you? You're seen as a threat to the entire social and spiritual order, a literal agent of the devil.
Which, in a time when religious belief was so deeply intertwined with every aspect of life, is going to make you public enemy number one pretty darn quick.
It absolutely would. And these werewolf trials, they were often less about finding out the truth and more about, reinforcing that existing social order, about extracting confessions, even if those confessions came at a terrible price.
Right, because if someone is seen as a threat to the very fabric of society, well, all bets are off. And it makes you wonder how much of what we consider to be historical fact is really just a reflection of those societal anxieties, those deeply held beliefs.
It's a valid question, and it's one that we're going to keep circling back to as we dig deeper into Stumpp's case. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I think it's important to consider some alternative explanations, some factors that might have been at play that go beyond the supernatural.
Okay, so let's talk about those alternative explanations. You mentioned something called ergot poisoning earlier. What is that exactly?
So imagine this. You've got a staple food, like rye bread, right? And it gets contaminated with this fungus, ergot. Now, this fungus, it can have some pretty wild effects on the human body. We're talking hallucinations, convulsions, even psychosis.
Wow, that's intense. So you're saying that people could be experiencing these vivid, terrifying hallucinations, and in the context of the time, attribute them to supernatural forces like werewolves.
Exactly. It's a theory that's been explored quite a bit by both historians and scientists, and when you look at the symptoms of ergot poisoning, those hallucinations, delusions, that paranoia, well, it starts to paint a very different picture of what might have been happening in those villages, doesn't it?
It's like that saying, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, right?
Stranger and often much more terrifying, especially in an era where the line between reality and the supernatural was so blurry. But there's another possibility we need to consider, something called lycanthropy.
Lycanthropy, okay. Now that rings a bell, but remind us, what exactly is that?
So lycanthropy is a rare psychiatric condition where individuals genuinely believe they can transform into an animal, and in most cases, that animal is a wolf.
So not a magical belt, but an actual mental health condition that could have been a factor in Stumpp's case.
Precisely. It's entirely possible that his confession, however coerced it might have been, was influenced by a pre-existing delusion. And when you think about it, it makes the story even more tragic, doesn't it?
It really does. It's amazing how, with a little bit of distance, a little bit of knowledge, this story we thought we knew takes on these entirely new dimensions. We're not just talking about a werewolf trial anymore, but the complexities of mental health, the impact of something like ergot poisoning, and the power of these societal beliefs to shape not only our understanding of the world, but maybe even our own perceptions of reality. It's like we're piecing together this historical puzzle, but the image keeps shifting as we find new pieces. We've got ergot poisoning, lycanthropy, torture, and yet even with all these explanations, there's something about the werewolf myth that it just sticks with us. Why do you think that is? What is it about these stories that continue to fascinate us, even today?
Well, I think it's because the werewolf, for centuries really, has served as this kind of cultural mirror, It reflects back our deepest fears and anxieties. In Stumpp's time, it was the devil, witchcraft, the unknown. But those fears, they don't really disappear, do they? They just sort of morph, change with each generation.
So what are our werewolves today then? What fears do they represent in our modern world?
That's a great question. Think about it. The fear of losing control, right? The fear of the animalistic side of human nature, the idea that there's this thin line between civilization and chaos. These are all themes that still resonate really strongly with people today, maybe even more so in a world that often feels very unpredictable and chaotic.
It's like the werewolf embodies that sense of unease, that fear that things can spiral out of control at any moment. And what I find so interesting is that even if we can rationalize parts of the Werewolf of Bedburg story, even if we can point to things like ergot poisoning and lycanthropy, there's still this lingering sense of mystery, of something unexplainable that keeps us hooked.
It's the power of a good story, right? That blend of mystery, horror, the way it takes something familiar like a man and twists it into something utterly unknown and terrifying. We're drawn to those kinds of narratives, even if they make us a bit uncomfortable, because on some level, I think they force us to confront something primal within ourselves.
It's like those stories, those glimpses into the darkness, they help us understand or maybe just grapple with what it means to be human. They remind us that there are still things out there, forces both within and outside of ourselves, that we may never fully understand.
And the fact that we're still talking about Peter Stumpp centuries later, debating his guilt or innocence, trying to make sense of the events of that time, it just proves how powerful those stories can be, how they can worm their way into our collective imagination and refuse to let go.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Werewolf of Bedburg, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this story? What's the lasting legacy, the enduring mystery?
For me, it's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. It's messy, it's complicated, it's a tapestry woven from fact and fiction, belief and evidence, individual experience, and collective memory. And as we try to make sense of the past, as we grapple with the stories we tell ourselves about the world, I think it's crucial to remember that sometimes the most compelling mysteries are the ones without easy answers.
Perfectly said. Because it's in those unanswered questions, those lingering mysteries, that we often find the most fertile ground for reflection, for challenging our assumptions, for expanding our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. So, to our listeners out there, the next time you hear a tale that sends shivers down your spine, a story that blends history and folklore, fact and fiction, remember the Werewolf of Bedburg. Remember that the most fascinating stories are often those that force us to confront the unknown, to embrace the mystery, and to never ever stop questioning what we think we know.